Chronicles ride again through the kings of Judah and listening to all the things that happened to them. One thing that stuck out to me is as we go through theirs over and over again, the idea of the humility of the king. It seemed like the ones who humble themselves recognize that they are not God. They become pretty good leaders. And those who are arrogant or proud or conceited, filled of themselves, those ones tend to find themselves being one of those bad kings, leading their people astray, leading them to false religions and false practices, detect the detestable things that they do. So there's a thing that stuck out to me is just that interesting note that the writer of Chronicles continues to tell us: those who are showing that humility and that humbleness, and versus those who are showing the arrogance. And I think, talk about humbleness, that's where we get to Ezra and Nehemiah. And as we spend some time with them, we're going to read the book of Ezra tomorrow and Saturday, and then get into the book of Nehemiah next week, and then get to Esther, and then we'll actually be done for the Old Testament for a while. We'll be done with like the historical kind of books that give us the kind of play-by-play of what happens to the people, especially at the end of the time here when Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah is the beginning of the return of the people of Israel from the Babylonian captivity, also during the people of Persia as well. So we see how God perfectly positions Ezra and Nehemiah to do just that. Now, of course, when we do a new book or a new section, we'd love to share with you those Bible project videos, some helpful insight. Don't always agree necessarily with everything. I know they think like this used to be one book, but I was reading a couple other scholars on there that says probably not. But anyways, there's still some helpful insights to give us kind of an overview of where we're going. And then this weekend, we'll talk some more about Nehemiah, especially Nehemiah chapter 5. I think that's some pretty relevant conversation, some of the things that Nehemiah faces. So we got Nehemiah, his story. I mean, first of all, he humbles himself. When he hears about what's happening in Jerusalem, instead of being arrogant and conceited and saying, well, at least my family's secure, at least I got a good job, at least I don't have to worry about that. He humbles himself and recognizes the people's story in Jerusalem and Judah is his story. And so humbles himself to the point of going to the king and making an incredible request of the most powerful person in the world at that time, King Artaxerxes of Persia. And so we're going to watch some more about that story, give you a little bit of that overview, prepare you for what's coming next in our Bible binge as we finish off these final 3 books in the historical section of the Old Testament. And then as we jump then into the New Testament, getting to Corinthians, I think is our next journey there. And we're going to go through a couple other letters of Paul as well as we continue our journey this summer. Hope you are staying dry and got plenty of rain for the land around you. If you have any issues, we always got people willing to help and assist. We've got the flood stuff from the years of dealing with flooding issues. God bless us as we get back on our feet. But hopefully you're all doing well and wherever you're at. So let me get to the video. Let's get there. The Bible Binge video from the Bible Project. Here you go.
The books of Ezra and Nehemiah. In most modern Bibles, these books are separate, but that division happened long after it was written. It was originally a unified work written by a single author. The story is set after the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem and its temple and took many of the people into exile. And this book picks up about 50 years later and tells the return of some Israelites to Jerusalem, and then what happened when they rebuilt the city and their lives there. Specifically, the book focuses on 3 key leaders who led the rebuilding efforts. You have Zerubbabel, then Ezra, and then Nehemiah. And the book's design focuses on the efforts of each leader. Zerubbabel leads a large group of people back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. Then about 60 years later, Ezra arrives in Jerusalem to teach the Torah and rebuild the community. And then he's followed by Nehemiah, who leads the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls. And these 3 stories are designed to be parallel. Each begins with the king of Persia, prompted by God to send the leader to Jerusalem, and he offers resources and support. And then each leader encounters opposition in their efforts, which they then overcome, but in a way that leads to a strange anticlimax in each of the 3 parts. Let's back up and see how it fits together. So the story begins with a decree from Cyrus, the king of Persia, and he's moved by God to allow the exiles to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. And the author says this fulfills a promise made by the prophet Jeremiah that the exiles would one day return to Jerusalem. Now, This fulfillment should trigger our hopes in the many other prophetic promises that exile was not the end of the story. We have hope for a future messianic king from the line of David. We have hope for a rebuilt temple where God's presence will dwell with his people. Hope for God's kingdom to come over all the nations and bring his blessing, just like he promised to Abraham. And so it's with all these hopes in mind that we read on into the story of Zerubbabel. His name means planted in Babylon. He represents the generation born in Babylonian captivity, and he leads a wave of Israelites returning to Jerusalem. After they settle there, they rebuild the altar for offering sacrifices, and later the temple itself. The foundation-laying ceremony, and then the temple's final dedication, these are key moments. The past stories of the tabernacle and temple's dedication should be in our minds. This is when the fiery cloud of God's presence is supposed to descend. He's dwelling with his people, and it doesn't happen. And so while some people are happy about this new temple, the elders who had seen the previous temple of Solomon, they cry out in grief. It is nothing like their glorious past or their hopes for the future. And it's right here that we get the first story of opposition, and it's very odd. So the grandchildren of the Israelites who were not taken into exile, they had been living in Jerusalem all along, they come to offer help with the temple rebuilding. And Zerubbabel refuses. He says, "You have no part in our temple." And this, of course, generates a conflict which Zerubbabel overcomes, but it's very strange because the prophets had envisioned that the tribes of Israel would all come together, along with all of the nations, to participate in the worship of the God of Israel when the kingdom finally comes. So this is an anticlimactic moment, to say the least. In the next section, we zoom forward about 60 years and we're introduced to Ezra. He's a leader among the exiled Israelites in Babylon. And he's a Torah scholar and a teacher. And so he gets appointed by Artaxerxes, king of Persia, to lead another wave of people back to Jerusalem. And Ezra wants to bring about spiritual and social renewal among the people. Our hopes are high. And again, we come to another anticlimactic moment in the story. Ezra learns that many of the exiled Israelites that had come back, they had married non-exiles who had been living around Jerusalem. Some of them were non-Israelites, and almost certainly some of them were. Ezra then appeals to the commands of the Torah, that Israel was supposed to be holy and separate from the ancient Canaanites. And he then says that the people living around Jerusalem are like the Canaanites. They're going to corrupt the exiles. So Ezra offers a prayer of repentance, and it's very heartfelt. But then he rallies all the leaders and enacts this divorce decree that says all these marriages should be annulled, the women and children sent away. And then the decree is only partially carried out. We're given a list of some of the men who divorced their wives. The story is very strange for a number of reasons. First of all, God never commanded Ezra to do any of this. It was the leaders of Jerusalem who led Ezra to make the decree. Second, the contemporary prophet Malachi, he did say that the exiles should care about purity, but he also said that God was opposed to divorce. And so the mixed results of the decree, this all fits into this pattern of a strange concluding anticlimax. Which leads us to the next section about Nehemiah. He's an Israelite official serving in the Persian government, and when he hears about the ruined state of Jerusalem's walls, he prays and then gets permission from the Persian king Artaxerxes to go and rebuild the walls. The king even gives them an armed escort and all these resources. So after arriving in Jerusalem, he begins the building project, and he too faces opposition from the people who had already been living around Jerusalem. Once again, we face a tension in the story. The contemporary prophet Zechariah said that the new Jerusalem of God's kingdom would be a city without walls, that God's presence would surround it, and people from all nations would come and join the covenant people. But Nehemiah seems to operate with the opposite vision. He informs the people surrounding Jerusalem that they have no part in Jerusalem. And this, of course, provokes them to hostility. And so while Nehemiah carries out his vision for the city with integrity and courage, they have to build the city with armed guards to protect them, we keep wondering, could this whole conflict have been handled differently? And this all leads to the conclusion of the book in two movements, first positive and then negative. Ezra and Nehemiah combine forces to bring about a spiritual renewal among the people. They gather all the exiles together for a festival. They read and teach the Torah to all the people for 7 days. And then they celebrate the ancient Feast of Tabernacles to remember God's faithfulness from the Exodus and the wilderness journeys. Then they offer a confession of their sins. They vow themselves to renew the covenant, follow all the commands of the Torah. And they finish with a great celebration over the temple, the walls of Jerusalem. And we're thinking, this could be the turning point, but it's not. The book ends on a huge downer. Nehemiah tours around the city, and he finds that the people have not been fulfilling their covenant vows. So Zerubbabel's work is undone as he finds the temple being neglected and staffed by all these unqualified people. He then discovers that Ezra's work is being compromised. He finds everyone violating the Torah, people are working on the Sabbath, and even his own work on the walls is involved because people are setting up markets around the walls of Jerusalem and working on the Sabbath. So Nehemiah, he goes on a rampage. He's beating people up, he's pulling out their hair, and he's yelling, "Obey the commands of the Torah." And his final words are a prayer that God would remember him, that at least he tried, and the book ends. I mean, it's very strange. But we've been prepared for it, right? These anticlimactic moments have been woven into the book's design intentionally. And so it raises the question, what on earth does this book contribute to the storyline of the Bible? Well, remember, the book started by raising our hopes in the prophetic promises about the Messiah, the temple, the kingdom of God, and then none of it happens. So even though Israel is now back in the land, their spiritual state seems unchanged from before the exile. And while Ezra and Nehemiah, they do their best, but their political and social reforms among the people don't address the core issues of their heart. So what the book is pointing out is the same need highlighted by the prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel. What God's people need is a holistic transformation of their hearts if they're ever going to love and obey their God. And so the book ends on a downer, yes, but it forces you to keep reading on into the wisdom and prophetic books to find out what is God going to do to fulfill his great covenant promises. But for now, that's the book of Ezra and Nehemiah.
That is the question. What is God going to do to fulfill his covenant promises? As we see Ezra and Nehemiah even rebuilding, Nehemiah rebuilding the walls, Ezra before him with Zerubbabel rebuilding the temple, Ezra coming to teach the law, Nehemiah rebuilding the walls, trying to bring about the restoration. And I think for me, one of the things, he doesn't mention it really in the video, but in that last chapter of Nehemiah, where he kind of just goes off on people and, basically is kind of almost like a parent on a rampage. Like, you know the rules, you know the laws, you know the house rules. Why don't you do them? And it gets to the point where that recognition of, because I'm a sinner, because I'm a poor, miserable sinner. That's why I don't do them. I can't keep the law perfectly. And Nehemiah seems to almost be like, well, why can't you do it? And if he's honest with him, he knows he can't do it either. And there's a frustration that comes with that at sometimes too, where Paul will write about it in the New Testament. The good I want to do, I don't do. The evil I don't want to do, it's just right there, and I keep on doing. And then Paul says, what a wretched man that I am, which is another way of humbling ourselves, as Nehemiah did at the beginning, as we saw some of the good kings do as well. And the Apostle Paul shows it as well. In fact, the greatest humility of all is seen in Jesus Christ himself, humbled himself to become obedient unto death, even death on a cross for us. And that is that answer, right? Not keeping the law by keeping more laws or doing everything right. It just shows us our sin. It shows us our brokenness. It shows how far we are from fulfilling the law of the Lord and the glory of God. Even our desires get corrupted by that as well. So, good news. We don't end with laws and trying to keep it better. We end with Jesus. That's the glory of the Lord, filling the temple in Jerusalem when it departs, when the temple is destroyed, and it isn't, quote, return during the time of Zerubbabel. It does return in the time of Jesus. And he is the glory of the Lord that fills that temple. And he is the one who shows us the Father. If we want to know who God is, we look at Jesus and we look what he says. We look what he does. We look what he's willing to give for us to welcome us back home. So my prayer for you as you go through the last couple of books here in the Old Testament before we jump back into the New Testament on our Bible binge is that you continue to walk in that word, and that word would be a lamp to your feet and a light to your path, especially here in the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and we'll get there soon, Ruth as well. Blessings on your readings and your word, and in that